So I'll start by just mentioning, I think Yotascale is one of the solutions that can manage Kubernetes across multiple environments. I'll kind of weave that in to my discussion here a little bit as we're going along. So basically, let me just talk a little bit about what Yotascale does. So we're a cloud cost visibility and management piece of software. So what we do is we basically use the data that comes directly from your cloud environments to better give you visibility into the allocation of your budget across potentially multiple clouds if you've got multiple cloud environments that you operate in. We currently support AWS and Azure. Next year we'll be supporting GCP as well, probably moving into other clouds from there, but that gets us, I think, north of 70% of the current footprint that's out there with those three. So I think that everybody kind of understands this intuitively, but I can say that for me, as somebody who has been a software leader for a long time, probably a lot of you who are listening as well, my number one item in my budget is always payroll. My number two budget has always been infrastructure. That used to be rack-mount servers. These days, of course, it's all moved into almost entirely to the cloud, and it's frustrating because there's very little visibility that you have into that at times. My experience has been it's pretty easy for me to keep a handle on my payroll. I know exactly where all those dollars are going. It can be very, very difficult to dive in and figure that out. And the larger and more complex your organization, your ecosystem gets, the more challenging it is to figure that out. Just a few numbers here that I think were astonishing when this is a pain point I felt before moving to Yotascale, but then once I started doing the research into it from working here, so between idle and over-provisioned resources, $26.6 billion will be wasted in cloud spend in 2021. The footprint of just the wasted electricity there is pretty huge. Executive estimate that 30% of their cloud spend is wasted. That's a lot. That's a lot of compute power that's literally doing absolutely nothing. And I think that where this impacts all of us as technology leaders in our budgets, overshooting by an average of 24% due to lack of cost optimization. The way that I tend to think about this for myself, of trying to think about like, well, how much of a pain point is this really? Is if you've got a fairly modest web footprint or cloud footprint, if you spend maybe $500,000 a month on your web costs, when you start to do the math and think about what this number really represents, you start to get into the territory pretty soon of where you could be hiring extra engineers if you simply have the tools to, if you just took the money from putting in place tools to make it so you're not spending money on resources that are quite literally doing nothing, and then putting those towards hiring more people to build your products. That's very much what our software helps you do. So I'll just kind of breeze through this so I can get into sort of the meat of the presentation about what the challenges are around this. There's a lack of visibility. A lot of times cost attribution is still manual. I know a lot of people still do this based on just putting together Excel spreadsheets where they're pulling things out of the cloud native tools, looking at like Cost Explorer or something like that in AWS, similar things in other platforms, but there's not a baked-in all-in-one tool. There's also not ways to do that across clouds, right? There's certainly not a baked-in way to look at your cloud spend across AWS and across Azure and in the future GCP as well. One of the challenges there is that there's not a lot of incentive for the cloud native companies like Amazon and Google to give you those tools right off. They're going to go across infrastructures and compare those. It's just not in their makeup. They're focused on making the best of breed tools that they actually can in their platforms. And so I think a third party like us steps in to fill this void really nicely. So I want to talk about a couple of case studies here of companies that are customers of ours to say where this has actually made an impact on them. So let's start with Zoom, assuming everybody here has heard of Zoom. Zoom actually was a customer of ours starting before the pandemic, but I think we were pretty integral part of their operations through a challenging period of time here for them. Their annual spend, as you can see on here, it's north of $500 million. So that's a lot of money that they're spending overall. And so for them, one of the challenges is that they charge on a per head basis, but essentially you can consume as much data as meetings that you have, and so they have to really keep a close eye on their infrastructure costs to make sure that model still makes sense. So how do they do that? Well, they wanted to identify what were underutilized resources and the cost of those underutilized resources. They knew they had parts of their environment where they were overspending and not getting the value out of it, but didn't know where. They didn't have the tools to actually get in and see, okay, well, where are those servers that are spending us the money that we don't need to be spending? They also need to balance performance with cost management, right? You can't just go in and start shutting off servers left and right. You need to make sure that you're making intelligent choices and forecasted choices about where you're going to spend that money or not spend that money. If you only know that you've gone over your projections at the point that you've overshot it, it's kind of too late. And finally, managing year-over-year business growth. They wanted to make sure that they're doing things in a way that is sustainable and in terms of long-term planning, not just sort of jumping on whatever's a hot issue right then and having a lot of context switching for their engineers. So after working with Yotascale, what are some of the results here? Well, they shut down multiple zero activity resources. We were able to help them go in and find places in their infrastructure that were quite literally unutilized instances that had been spun up, or places where maybe they had auto-scaled up instances that didn't get auto-scaled down. But finding all these places where there were clusters of compute resources that were used, that had been spun up and were quite literally doing nothing, which is not a one-time activity, by the way. This is something that's on an ongoing basis as developers do things like, let's say, spin up things in development or staging environments, and then maybe there's a process that either manually they spun them up and didn't take them down, or they spun them up with Terraform and then tried to spin them back down, but then something didn't work. Those instances stayed around and didn't actually get shut down properly. And this substantially improved their cloud ROI. In this sort of challenging environment they have where they need to be always available and always up, they also need to make sure that they really cut down on their costs to an absolute minimum to make that business model sustainable. And I think that's one of the things that we were really able to help them do. This kind of gives you an example of one of the challenges here. So when we're looking at, what's being represented here? Why is this a challenge? So let's say you have two workloads. You have workload 1 is the blue one, workload 2 is the blue one. If you're looking at a containerized environment, you're probably familiar with what this actually matches up to. But on a given instance, and that's over here on the left, you have in availability zones 3. This is the circled part. You have one instance here that we're taking a look at. You might have, on a given instance, some portion of the CPU usage is consumed by workload 1, some other percent is consumed by workload 2. You might have a different split of the memory usage on there that's consumed by both of those, and finally the storage, right? And you can see from the graph kind of demonstrating here, it's a different percentage of the memory, the storage, and the CPU consumed by each one of those workloads. And this is typical in a containerized environment. It makes it a lot easier for you to just buy a massive chunk of compute power and not have to think too hard about how you can make sure you have enough total capacity. But it's hard to get in and actually get the visibility of how workloads were scheduled across those instances for what chunks of the day and which resources that they actually used. And then the other challenge you have is, well, how do you map that to a business context, right? So let's say you even understand how those workloads were split up among your physical resources. You then have this additional problem of you need to somehow map that to either business units or customers you're servicing, or whether it's a development environment versus a staging environment. There's all these different, we call them lenses that you can view this through. And so you need to have a tool that's very savvy that can help you to map those different tags that are on your instances to different business context rules. Now, this unlocks a lot of power for a company like Zoom that has really a pretty large footprint and a complex environment. What it allows you to do, if you look over at this fourth column here, is you can see that you have these fairly complex rule sets that you can put together that basically let you say, okay, well, let's take these tags and combine them together in an intelligent way so that we can map those to some meaningful business context in the Yotascale UI. So rather than just saying, well, here's a bunch of tags on instances that were created over the last 5 years, and you have to mentally piece together how do I get some sense or meaning out of those. You do that one time in this engine that we have for building these tags or building these business context rules out of tags, and that then gives you the meaning that you need to say, oh, okay, I understand now. I can drill down and see, first level, let me look into everything in my production environment. Second level, let me look at everything that we're using for R&D. Third level, let me look at everything owned by this particular user. And it's a good way of being able to drill down deeper and deeper. It's probably a very familiar way of analyzing data if you've used any BI tools out there in the past. So let me talk a little bit too about Compass. Compass is another one of our customers that we love to talk about as an example here. This might be more in the footprint of you're thinking, well, okay, that's great for a company like Zoom, but how about somebody with a more modest spend? If I'm not one of the Zooms of the world, Compass still has 10 million plus in AWS spend. That's something that we're I think is probably more familiar to some of the people listening out here of like the challenges they might have. So you don't need to have a huge footprint to know why things like this matter, right? And they had a slightly different challenge for Zoom. For them, they wanted to make engineering leads and management managers more accountable to thinking about cost as one of the properties that they're building for, right? And probably a lot of you have gone through this journey where you start with engineers who are really good at thinking about their tools in terms of functionality, right? Like best engineering practices, having good architecture, reducing coupling, things like that. At some point, maybe you layered in security as a vector to look at too, right? Make sure that your applications are secure. One of the things that happens with your cloud architecture is that I think engineers inherently want to build software that's efficient, and they don't want to overspend and get a bunch of servers that they don't need. They simply don't have the tools and the visibility to do that. So in some sense, engineers want to be accountable to this. They want to make good technology decisions to make sure they're not overspending. They simply don't have the tools to be able to look into that, and so most engineering organizations don't make it a priority. So in Compass's case, they wanted to establish the cost in the context of Compass's products, which really just means that they wanted to think about how do we build our products as we're thinking about our software development lifecycle, to really think about how do you build it so that cost becomes one of the parts of the conversation and the dialect that we have as we're going through the software development lifecycle of building these projects. And then finally, driving efficiencies given the pandemic's business impact. Compass is a very large real estate company. Obviously, this had impact on their operations, and they needed to very quickly think about how can we bake this into our business model and find some efficiencies here. In their case, the result was overall 45% cost reduction. So we're able to literally almost half their costs that they had of running their cloud footprint simply by pointing Yotascale at it. In this case, you can see that Yotascale for how do we apply that to Compass? Well, this is really designed for architecture scale, right? We really help them to get in and see. Number one, there's really three pillars here that we helped Compass with. One is observability, second is predictability, and third is efficiency. Kind of breaking down what this looks like for them. Observability is giving, that's the part of really giving the insights. We looked at that kind of in the last couple of slides of how do you do that tag mapping, how do you give a really deep business context of being able to give like a drill down into your environment. And how do you give multiple lenses to be able to view it through? Maybe finance wants to see it one way, engineers want to see it a different way. So we allowed them to cut the data in different ways so they could see, okay, where can we get those savings by either cutting out business elements that are services that maybe aren't working, or speed up some processes of deprecating services that are old and we were on the way out anyways. Predictability is more about a layer on top of that of saying, if you can say that a given team, let's say, has a fixed budget for the month, you can put that in, and then we can say in advance by using some of our machine learning algorithms we built, okay, how are you tracking against that, right? Based on what the cost curve looks like of, are you growing faster than expected? And we can send out warnings and things to let you know, hey, it's the 15th of the month, but by the 30th, we're 90% sure that you're going to overshoot your budget. So you might want to plan now to cut back on some things if you can to account for that. And finally, efficiency. That's the last one. We give these actionable recommendations outside of just like the budget and forecasting part. We can actually say things like, and have said things to Compass like, hey, you're using a bunch of on-demand instances. This is something you can convert over to reserved instances. Or maybe it's something that you're already in reserved instances, but you've locked into a one-year plan. You could really, based on your workload, it's pretty clear with your history and the business context you've mapped to it that you could expand that, or maybe you could pay all up front to get some more savings back. That's just one sort of very simple example of the type of recommendation that we give. There's many more in the system as well. So this is what we really see coming out of this, and I think this is where it made a big impact on on Compass in particular is this cost accuracy part. We're able to deliver 95% cost accuracy, right? So when you compare what comes out of the Cost Explorer in Amazon and sort of match that up to Yotascale, there's almost 100% overlap between those two. So you have the trust that the data that we've broken down really does map to reality. When you take that and you apply that to the fact that we're able to do this very deep cost attribution and be able to let people know exactly where those expenditures were going, what that ended up translating to was engineers being able to take that, turn that into much more actionable decisions, and to say, okay, well, we've got this plugged in, we're getting data now in a real-time fashion, not exactly real time, but daily fashion. Every day there's a new batch of data that comes in from ingesting the cost and resource usage files out of Amazon. And at that point, everyday engineers, what we found was they started just baking this into their culture and making this part of their practice there, right? Engineers just start looking into there, and you've probably seen this with tools like Datadog or Sumo Logic, that engineers, they start to get more curious about how this is really impacting their project workflow and start looking into it that way. And so because of that, the recommendations that we've given to Compass are really things that they've been able to take action on, and as you saw in that earlier slide, cut their costs almost literally in half. And finally, just some good customers that we've got on here. We already talked about Zoom and Compass. Jeffries is also one of the customers that you might have heard of on here that's really spoken highly of us. Of course, Hulu as well. They had some challenges we didn't have a chance to dive into in this webinar, but very similar of, if you have this model of paying for, you charge customers a fixed rate, but they can basically consume all they want. How do you keep on top of that? And Yotascale for them, similar fashion to Zoom, is a pretty big part of making that business model work for them. And so I'm going to leave it there for today. And if you want to see more, you can contact us for a demo. Our address is just www.yotascale.com. And we're happy to demo you and walk you through the product. We can show you with some real data what this is going to look like. And if it's something you're interested in, it's something that, depending on your setup, we can get you up and onboarded as quickly as just a couple of days.